The morning sunlight poured into the cabin as the plane cut through the clouds. Among the seated passengers was a tall, muscular black man who emanated an undeniable aura of authority, though he wore a simple shirt and jeans. Striding confidently down the aisle, Sarah, a flight attendant with striking beauty and a confidence she wore as easily as her uniform, balanced a tray of steaming cups of coffee. Her polished professionalism usually left passengers in awe, but something about the man sitting near the window caught her off guard. Approaching him, her gaze lingered a second too long, trying to place what made him so distinct. His presence was both commanding and calm, yet she shrugged it off with a slight roll of her eyes. "Just another passenger," she murmured to herself as she moved the tray closer to him. In a moment of distraction, a sudden turbulence rattled the plane, and the scalding coffee spilled over the rim, splashing onto his shirt. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, though her voice lacked the warmth she usually displayed with passengers. Her hands moved in swift, practiced gestures offering a napkin, but her quick, almost dismissive apology seemed to land awkwardly. His calm demeanor remained intact, but he looked at her with eyes that held a depth she hadn't expected. "It's okay," he replied, dabbing the stain with an ease that suggested he was used to remaining unruffled. But his gaze held hers a moment longer, as if he was assessing more than just her apology. Sarah, flustered, muttered another half-hearted sorry before turning away. As she returned to the galley, her colleague raised an eyebrow. "Did you see his badge?" "Badge?" she echoed, confused. "Yes, didn't you notice? He's a police chief," her colleague whispered, clearly impressed. "I caught a glimpse when he boarded, Chief Thomas Rogers." A wave of realization hit her, and her face turned slightly pale. She'd unintentionally been rude to a man with significant authority, someone she'd misjudged based on appearance alone. The error gnawed at her, and the more she thought about it, the deeper her regret grew. Knowing she couldn't let this slip-up go unanswered, she steeled herself to do something she had never done before. Later, as the plane's lights dimmed for the evening, Sarah mustered her courage and approached him. In a soft, controlled tone, she whispered, "Excuse me, sir. Chief Rogers, I'd like to offer you a more private apology." She gestured subtly toward the back of the plane, where the lavatories offered a secluded space. The cabin lights had dimmed, casting a quiet glow over the plane as passengers settled into their seats, lulled by the steady hum of engines. Heart pounding softly, Sarah guided Chief Rogers to the back of the plane. Her mind raced, but she maintained a composed expression, determined to make her apology both sincere and professional. She knew she had been too quick to judge him earlier, and she didn't want to leave this encounter tainted by her misjudgment. As they reached the privacy of the rear section, Sarah took a steadying breath and turned to face him. "Chief Rogers," she began, her voice softer than before, carrying an undertone of genuine regret. "I owe you a sincere apology. My actions earlier were, well, unprofessional and unfair. I didn't recognize who you were, but that's no excuse for treating you poorly." Thomas listened to her words, his arms crossed, but his expression softened. He remained silent, allowing her space to express what she needed to say. "It wasn't right for me to jump to conclusions," Sarah continued, her gaze now unwavering. "I hope I can make up for my rudeness." He raised an eyebrow, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "Miss?" "Sarah," she answered, clearing her throat. "Just Sarah." "All right, Sarah," he replied, his voice carrying a deep warmth, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Everyone makes mistakes. I'm no stranger to that, but I respect you for taking the time to apologize." A silence settled between them, charged with an intensity that neither had anticipated. In the confined space of the lavatory corridor, their breaths mingled, and she felt an inexplicable pull toward him. The air grew thick with unspoken words, each aware of the other's presence in a way that was both unfamiliar and magnetic. Without thinking, she reached out, touching his arm, her fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Thomas's gaze softened, the understanding between them deepening with each passing second. The formality between them began to dissolve, replaced by a raw connection that felt entirely beyond her control. Her heart raced, her mind a tangle of thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. She was aware of every breath, every heartbeat, as if time had slowed down just for this moment. He took a small step closer, their faces mere inches apart, and she felt a warmth radiating from him that sent a shiver down her spine. In the close quarters, every movement felt amplified. His hand moved gently to brush her hair back from her face, his touch gentle yet grounding, as though conveying his understanding without words. There was an elegance in the way he held himself, an authority tempered with kindness. She felt an overwhelming need to bridge the gap between them, as though an invisible force was drawing them together. In that brief moment, the world outside the small, quiet space of the plane's lavatory corridor disappeared. She was no longer a flight attendant, and he wasn't the police chief she had inadvertently insulted. They were simply two souls who had found themselves in an unanticipated, undeniably intense moment. Her breath hitched as his hand slipped to her shoulder, his touch light but firm, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had blossomed between them. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to make the first move, locked in a delicate balance of unspoken desire. Finally, her voice barely a whisper, she murmured, "Thomas, I didn't expect this." "Neither did I," he replied, his voice low, his gaze holding hers with a gravity that sent a spark through her. "But some things don't need explanations, do they?" Their hands met in an almost instinctive gesture, fingers entwining in a silent understanding. The moment lingered, each of them leaning into the sensation, an unspoken promise hanging in the air. In the days following that fateful flight, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the moments she had shared with Thomas. Her routine on flights continued as usual, yet her mind was often occupied by memories of his steady gaze, his calming presence, and the warmth of his touch. She hadn't anticipated that a single apology could open up a world of new feelings. And even more surprising was her growing anticipation of their next encounter, as if their meeting was inevitable, woven by fate. When they eventually arranged to meet again, away from the prying eyes of colleagues and passengers, it was in a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe near the city center. Sarah arrived first, her heart pounding in her chest as she sat by a small table, looking out the window at the bustling streets outside. She sipped her coffee absently, almost smiling at the memory of how everything had started with a spilled cup. A few minutes later, Thomas walked in, his tall frame and poised stride making her heart skip. He spotted her and approached with that familiar calmness, a small smile on his lips. When he sat down across from her, the space between them seemed to disappear, as if an invisible thread connected them, pulling them closer even in silence. "Sarah," he greeted her, his voice soft but steady. "Thomas," she replied, meeting his gaze with a blend of excitement and nervousness. They began talking, their conversation flowing effortlessly from the mundane to the personal, each word building a bridge between them. She learned that he carried the weight of his job as a police chief with both pride and humility, the kind of man who had spent years navigating difficult decisions and complex situations. He shared stories from his career, moments that highlighted his strength, resilience, and integrity, qualities that only deepened her admiration for him. Sarah, in turn, found herself opening up about her life, her dreams, and the reasons she'd chosen the unpredictable world of flight. She described the thrill of travel, the freedom of the skies, and yet the occasional loneliness of a life spent largely in transit. As she spoke, she noticed Thomas watching her with a gentle intensity, as if her words held a deeper resonance for him. They met several times over the next few weeks, slipping away from their daily routines into a shared world of laughter, confidences, and shared silences. Their connection deepened with each meeting, a mixture of genuine friendship and an unspoken passion that simmered just beneath the surface. It was a delicate dance, one they both seemed to understand instinctively, neither pushing nor pulling too hard, allowing the relationship to unfold at its own pace. One evening, they found themselves walking along a quiet riverside, the city lights shimmering across the water. The air was filled with the sound of distant traffic and the occasional laughter of passers-by. But all Sarah could focus on was the warmth of Thomas's hand as it brushed against hers. They stopped by a secluded bench, and without words, he took her hand in his touch both tender and grounding. In the dim light, his gaze held hers with a mix of curiosity and intensity, as if he was searching for answers in the depths of her eyes. She felt her breath catch, her pulse quickened as he leaned in, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "Sarah," he whispered, his thumb tracing gentle circles along the back of her hand. "There's something between us, something I can't ignore." Her response was a soft nod, her words lost in the rush of emotions that filled her. She felt his hand move to her shoulder, pulling her closer, his touch both hesitant and assured, as though he was savoring each moment. The world around them faded, leaving only the warmth of his embrace and the steady rhythm of their breaths. In that moment, she felt as if she were suspended between reality and a dream, her senses heightened by the intimacy that had grown between them. His lips brushed hers in a feather-light kiss, a touch that conveyed a depth of feeling that words could not. Her hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer as their kiss deepened. A silent conversation unfolding between them. As they parted, his fingers lingered on her cheek, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that left her breathless. The air between them was charged with an unspoken promise, a connection that went beyond the physical. It was a bond born of understanding, respect, and the powerful pull of two souls that had somehow found each other in the vastness of the world. In the quiet of the evening, they walked back hand in hand, their hearts intertwined in a secret melody known only to them. The months that followed were a whirl of private meetings, hidden smiles, and longing glances exchanged across crowded rooms. Sarah and Thomas had fallen into a rhythm, each moment together filled with unspoken trust and intensity. Every rendezvous brought a deeper connection, and with each passing day their bond grew stronger. One evening they found themselves in a small candle-lit room of a quaint hotel far from the city's noise. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that held anticipation, a stillness charged with promise. Outside, a soft rain fell, tapping gently against the windows, as though the world beyond was hushed in reverence for what was about to unfold. Thomas was standing by the window, his silhouette framed by the glow of streetlights outside. His gaze was lost in thought, and Sarah, watching him, felt a pang of tenderness. She approached him, her steps light and deliberate, until she was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. He turned to face her, and in the dim light his eyes held a depth she hadn't seen before. Vulnerable, yet unbreakable. Without a word, he reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was like a spark, igniting a fire within her that had been building with each of their encounters. He moved his hand to her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin, lingering just a second longer than necessary. Her breath quickened as she looked into his eyes, feeling the weight of every moment they had shared up to this point. He leaned in, capturing her lips with a kiss that was both tender and consuming, as if he were pouring every unspoken feeling into that single touch. She melted into his arms, her hands finding their way to his shoulders, feeling the strength and solidity of him grounding her in that moment. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if savoring each second. His hands traveled to the small of her back, pulling her closer, their bodies fitting together as though they had been made for each other. His touch was gentle yet firm, conveying a silent reassurance that sent a thrill through her. Each caress, each movement was a symphony of sensations, a harmony of closeness that brought them together in a way that transcended words. They found their way to the bed, moving as one, their breaths mingling in the stillness of the room. His hands traced the contours of her back, igniting a trail of warmth that left her trembling. She felt his lips against her skin, each kiss like a whispered promise, a declaration of the connection they shared. Every touch was a song, each note building on the last, weaving a melody that resonated deep within them. In the dim light, their bodies moved together in a rhythm that felt ancient and timeless, a dance as old as the stars. She felt the strength of his arms around her, grounding her as their connection grew with each passing second. It was a symphony of closeness, each movement carrying them higher, like waves building upon each other, crashing into the shore with undeniable power. The world around them faded, leaving only the sensation of skin against skin, the soft gasps and the quiet hum of rain outside. She was aware of every heartbeat, every breath, as if their souls were intertwined, lost in a dance of connection. Each movement, each touch was an unspoken vow, a testament to the depth of feeling that had blossomed between them. As they reached the height of connection, she felt a surge of emotion, a wave that swept over her, leaving her breathless. The world spun, a crescendo that built and built until it shattered, leaving only a quiet, peaceful stillness. They lay together, their bodies entwined, their breaths mingling in the aftermath of the symphony they had created. In the silence that followed, Thomas's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of unspoken intimacy. They lay there, content in each other's embrace, the rain outside a gentle lullaby, a soothing rhythm that carried them to a peaceful reverie. The quiet peace of the room wrapped around them, a reminder that they had found something rare and beautiful in each other. As the night wore on, they held each other, their hands never letting go. Each of them knowing that this connection was more than a fleeting moment. It was a bond that had been etched deep within their hearts, a love that would remain with them no matter where life took them. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. Sarah stirred awake, feeling the steady rise and fall of Thomas's chest beneath her head. Wrapped in his embrace, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if the world had finally stilled, leaving them in a quiet sanctuary away from everything. They lay in silence, savoring the calm after the intensity of the night. Thomas's hand traced gentle patterns along her arm, each touch grounding her, reminding her of the depth of what they shared. For the first time in a long while, she felt complete, as though all the missing pieces of her life had come together in this single, tender moment. As they finally rose, the world beyond the room began to creep back into focus, but something between them had shifted. No longer did they feel the need to hide or disguise what was between them. Each shared glance, every soft smile, spoke volumes of the affection that had taken root, blossoming quietly over the course of their time together. They decided to venture out into the city, leaving the cozy warmth of the room behind. Walking hand in hand through the winding streets, they marveled at how natural it felt to be beside one another in the open, as if they had always belonged there. They laughed together, sharing stories and quiet moments, enjoying the simplicity of just being themselves. At a small cafe tucked away in a quiet alley, they settled in for breakfast. Sarah watched as Thomas ordered with a relaxed ease, his deep voice resonating as he spoke to the waiter. She found herself mesmerized by the smallest details, the way he lifted his cup, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. These were moments she knew she would carry with her always. When he looked up, catching her gaze, he reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft yet full of intent. "I never expected this. Us. But now, I can't imagine life without it." Her heart swelled at his words, a smile spreading across her face as she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Me neither," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel the weight of their connection settling into something real, something that didn't need the walls of secrecy or the cloak of night to exist. They spent the rest of the day together, exploring the city, each moment building on the quiet understanding that they shared something deep and unshakable. By evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the skyline, they found themselves on a hill overlooking the city. Standing side by side, they watched the world transform as the lights blinked to life below them, a mosaic of colors stretching into the distance. Thomas turned to her, pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that felt both protective and freeing. They stood in silence, sharing the view, each of them lost in their thoughts, yet bound together by the invisible thread of their shared experience. The quiet between them held a profound sense of comfort, the kind that only came when two people were truly at ease with one another. As night fell, they returned to the hotel, and for the first time, there was no urgency in their movements, no need to rush. Instead, they took their time, each touch, each whispered word, a gentle reminder of the bond they had built. Their closeness was now a symphony of soft notes, a quiet melody that spoke of trust, respect, and the kind of love that could only come from truly knowing one another. In the stillness of the night, as they lay together, Thomas held her close, his hand resting over her heart, feeling its steady beat. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice a low hum, "whatever happens next, this, us, I'll carry it with me always." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and nodded, her own hand resting over his heart. "Me too," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet determination. In that moment, they both knew that no matter where life took them, they would forever be bound by the memories they had created, the love that had blossomed so unexpectedly. As dawn approached, they held each other close, drifting in and out of sleep, savoring every last second of the peace they had found in each other's arms. The world beyond would call them back soon enough. But for now, they were simply two souls, connected by a bond that would remain with them long after the night ended. And so, with the first light of morning, they shared one final, lingering kiss, a promise wrapped in silence. They had found something rare, something beautiful, and though the world awaited, they knew they had changed each other forever. Their story would continue, perhaps apart, but always together in the memories they had woven under the soft glow of city lights, the gentle rhythm of rain, and the stillness of each other's embrace. The last morning together arrived quietly, a soft light slipping through the thin curtains, warming the room with a tender, golden hue. Sarah stirred first, her eyes lingering on Thomas as he slept, his features relaxed and softened in the early glow. She watched him for a moment, memorizing the quiet lines of his face, the peaceful rhythm of his breathing, and the warmth of his presence beside her. As if sensing her gaze, he opened his eyes, meeting her soft smile with one of his own. No words were needed, for both knew this day would be the closing chapter of their time together. She took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze as if grounding herself in the reality of their bond, a gesture he returned with an equal measure of understanding. They shared a quiet morning, savoring the finality of each moment as though every detail held a piece of their story. When they ventured outside, the world felt different, quieter, as if echoing the inevitability of their parting. They wandered through the city streets once more, visiting familiar places, reliving memories that had already begun to etch themselves into her heart. As the day wore on, they found themselves by a secluded garden, a hidden sanctuary where the vibrant colors of blooming flowers whispered of new beginnings, even as they stood on the brink of goodbye. Sarah reached for Thomas's hand, interlocking their fingers as they strolled through the winding paths in peaceful silence, finding solace in each other's presence. Eventually, they found a small bench shaded by an ancient tree, its branches a canopy of gentle whispers. Sitting side by side, they remained quiet, letting the sounds of birds and rustling leaves fill the spaces between them. It was here that Thomas finally broke the silence. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of emotion. "I don't regret a single moment with you. Everything we've shared, it's something I'll carry with me forever." She met his gaze, her heart tightening as she saw the honesty and warmth reflected in his eyes. "Me too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've changed me, Thomas, in ways I can't even begin to explain." The words hung in the air, a delicate acknowledgement of the connection that had blossomed between them, transcending the circumstances that had brought them together. She wanted to say so much more, to tell him about the joy, the peace, and the sense of belonging he had given her. But in the end, all she could do was look at him, hoping he understood everything that words could not express. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, they reluctantly made their way back, returning to the room where they had spent countless hours wrapped in the intimacy of shared whispers and quiet laughter. In the dimming light, they shared one last embrace, their bodies pressed close, as if they could somehow hold on to this moment forever. Their final kiss was unhurried, a tender, lingering farewell that held within it the weight of everything they had been to each other. It was a kiss filled with gratitude, with unspoken promises, and with the knowledge that, though their paths were now diverging, they would remain forever intertwined by the memories they had created. When they finally pulled apart, a tear slipped down her cheek, and he gently wiped it away, his touch as soft as the love that lingered between them. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered, his voice carrying a bittersweet finality. She managed a small nod, her lips forming the words she couldn't quite voice. He left the room first, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving her alone with the echoes of their time together. She stood there, letting the silence settle, her heart heavy but full of gratitude for the love they had shared. In the months that followed, Sarah often thought of Thomas, feeling his presence in the quiet moments, as if he were still with her, a comforting warmth that reminded her of all they had shared. She knew their story had ended, but she carried it within her like a cherished melody, a quiet song that would remain with her always. Though their paths had diverged, she felt his influence in everything she did, a reminder that sometimes love is not defined by time or permanence, but by the way it transforms us, leaving us forever changed. And as she moved forward, she did so with a heart that had been touched by the beauty of what they had shared, knowing that no matter where life took her, a part of him would always be with her, woven into the very fabric of her being. And in the quiet moments when the world was still, she could almost feel his hand in hers, a gentle, unseen presence that whispered of the love they had found, and the love they had let go.